Yeah, God often reveals himself in the midst of great difficulties. And we would rather that, God speak to us. We like it when things are going well and God speaks to us then. But sometimes, I don't know if it's because he has a harder time getting our attention or whatever, but when things get bad, then we pay attention. And, you look at your kids, and sometimes as your kids are growing up, they won't listen to you, and then they get in a really bad situation, and all of a sudden, they want mom and dad to show them how to get out of this situation, and so they listen. And so I suspect that that's the same thing here, that, God has now chosen to speak to Job. Up to this point, we've heard from Satan, we've heard from Job's wife, we've heard from Job's friends, we've heard from Job himself, and today, now we're going to see that God, out of a storm, he comes and speaks to Job and challenges human wisdom and strength. God affirms his power to create, his care for his creation, and the sovereign ability to maintain and keep control. He did not answer Job's questions or respond to his complaints. When I thought about that, I thought, you know what? Many times that's the way it is. I ask God these questions and he just avoids the questions, it seems. He's got a bigger agenda than my questions or my complaints. He gave Job an understanding of his mighty power. We need to hear God in the midst of our trouble. That's if we can get that into our thinking, that in the midst of our trouble, God will speak to us. But that means we got to be listening. And the key verse is, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. In this passage, there's two names of God used in the original language, in the Hebrew. It's El Shaddai. El Shaddai means God's power over all creation. So when in the Hebrew language they refer to God as El Shaddai, they were saying he's the all-powerful God. And then the other one is Yahweh. Yahweh is simply in English spelled YHWH. And it really means Lord. And the reason it was written like that in the Hebrew is because they had such a reverence for God, they didn't even want to say his name, Yahweh. So they would spell that out as a way to show respect for God. They would be writing, and they wouldn't write out the name for God. They would write out this Yahweh. They would write it out. They tried to show respect for God by saying his name is so holy that we can't even write it out. And Yahweh means God is the sole creator of his people and is mighty to save. So in this passage of scripture that we're going to look at, when in the original language, there were some things, a lot of things get lost in translation. We lose the impact of what it says because we don't understand it. So we write it out, and in English, this is the way it is. But when you look at it, if you study it a little bit, and I'm not trying to leave the impression that I know Hebrew or know very much about it, but when I have studied it and looked at those words, it's like, wow, that's amazing, because in the original language, this carries a lot more impact than it does in English. And so I just want to call that to your attention. God's speech here is not about Job's trouble, but about God's great goodness or greatness. It's interesting. Job is telling God all of his troubles and spilling his guts before God, but God comes back and gives him a speech. And I think as we look at it, we'll see. Okay, so the first part of the lesson is God speaks from the whirlwind. The Lord's challenge to Job. Someone read chapter 38, verses 1 through 3. So God speaks to Job out of this whirlwind. And a whirlwind is often used in the Old Testament to signify God's power and strength. And so God is speaking to him, and God really questioned Job's understanding of things. Now, remember, God had said that Job was blameless and upright. So it wasn't that Job was a bad person. That wasn't the idea here. But he says, Job, speak out of the obscure plan. Job had spoken words that lacked understanding, is in other words what it's saying. He didn't really understand God. One person said it, interpreted this passage or these verses as saying, "Who do you think you are, Job?" That's what God was basically saying to him. Who do you think you are, Job? What's with you? God was about to ask Job a series of very challenging and telling questions. So notice how God handles this. He doesn't come in, "Oh, you poor baby, we're going to fix it for you, da 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 da." No, he says, "Okay, Job, we're going to take this to another level. You're going to learn some things here. I want you to grow. I want you to develop." Now, I'm going to say this, and I hope that I say this the right way, that God always wants us to grow and develop. And sometimes I want to say to God, I don't want to grow and develop that much. Just no, I don't like this. And he's like, "Oh, but you grow when you go through these kind of things. You develop." I've got it, God.
Right.
I'm right on target here. But God is saying, wait a minute. You think you understand? And that's where the interpretation that says, "So who do you think you are, Joe?" Sometimes, I mean, when you're raising children, sometimes you think they got it and you find out they don't have it.
Right.
But if you keep them from making a mistake, they don't get it. Yeah, it is. It's hard to say, okay, I'm going to let them have enough. The old saying is enough rope to hang themselves.
Yeah.
And I think God does that with us. He's like, "Okay, Wayne, if you think you got it, let's see what you got, you know." I remember a friend of mine had 4 boys. I think they have 4 boys. Anyway, and they, all through high school, they would cover for these boys. I mean, they would do crazy stuff. You can't even imagine. One time they were playing some stupid game in the car where they would try to climb out over the hood of the car and climb around while they're driving down the road.
Oh my gosh.
So they run into these people's house and they tore the house all up. And of course, their dad was a carpenter, a very good carpenter, by the way. And so Dad covered their backside. He went over and remodeled these people's house for them so they wouldn't file charges. And I mean, I could just go on and on and on and on. Bottom line was, the one boy ended up selling drugs and got put in the penitentiary for it. Big hardcore time. And then he was saying to his parents, "You need to come get me out." And they said, "We can't get you out. We don't have that kind of money. We don't have that kind of pull. We can't get you out." So he had to spend. And then he was very bitter about that. "I can't believe that you abandoned me in prison. I can't believe that God left me there. You were there because you broke the law." What? But I have to look at, because his parents didn't let him learn, they would bail him out. If they got in trouble at school, they'd go to the school and talk their way out of it, buy their way out of it, whatever, manipulate the situation. And so those boys were a mess. God doesn't do that with us, folks. He lets us run the course, and then he says, "Okay, wait a minute. Let me tell you what we're going to do to correct." And that's where it comes back to God saying to him, "Who do you think you are?" I think it comes down to God refuses to be manipulated.
Yeah.
It's like,
name it and claim it.
right. Yes. Yeah. He just refuses to be manipulated. He's like, "Oh, you think you can manipulate me? Well, let's see how that works for you. Just let's do it. Do what you got to do." No, I'm not doing that. But God, somebody said this is it. That was somebody. That wasn't me. Yeah. So let's look at the next passage where he tells Job, you need to learn from creation. Someone read verses 4 through 11. Okay, so he says, "Okay, Job, where were you at when I created all this?" did you set up the dimensions? Did you tell the sea where it could go? Did you set this all up? Where were you at? I don't remember consulting you to tell the sun to come up every morning and to do all that. I think what God's really wanting, and he wants us to be able to acknowledge our own ignorance and limitations, is a big step for us for wisdom. That's a hard step for us, though. It's interesting when, having taught some college classes, it's interesting how many of the first year students know so much. Oh, they know so much. They come in and you're like, you don't know what you're talking about. And so you let them say their thing, and then you point out, but what about this and what about that? And I think God is saying to Job, come on, just admit, Job, that you're ignorant. You were not there when all this was happening. Did you set the boundaries of the ocean? No, I set the boundaries. I'm the one who did all that. He is pointing out Job's inability to grasp the insight and power it took to create the world and to keep it operating. So, God is just pointing out those things about nature. And the remainder of this passage, verses 12 through 21, it talks about God's sovereignty over life and death. And remember, God was speaking to Job out of a whirlwind. God is choosing to speak to Job out of the storm. And many times in our life, when we're in the storm, that's when we can really make ourselves say, wait a minute, God, I thought I had this all figured out, but you know what? I don't have it figured out. I don't know what's going on. So let's move on to the next part of the lesson. God challenges Job's wisdom. Job's limited wisdom. Someone read chapter 39, verses 26 through 30. Okay, so he points out to Job, he says, wait a minute, let's look at the eagle and the hawk. And did you teach them how to fly? Did you teach them that they needed to build a nest? Did you teach them how to feed their young, that was important for them to feed their young, to get what their young bird, their babes need to eat? Did you teach them all that? Did you teach them that, Job? What's he trying to do? He's trying to get Job to focus off of his problem and focus on how great God is. Pastor several times recently has made the statement, if we get focused on God, it doesn't necessarily change who we are, but it changes our view of him. And that's what God is trying to get Job to get focused off of your problems and get focused on me. Look at how great all this is. And as Job gets focused there, then it changes his perspective. And that's what we need. We need our perspective changed. And so God is saying to him, get focused off of yourself. You ever been around people that are just focused on themselves? All they want to talk about is how sick they are and how much pain they're in. And you're just like, oh my goodness, it's so tiring to be here with them. I wish they'd get focused off of that. But then there are other people you go and they're really focused on the goodness of God, and they're in pain, they're suffering, they're going through it, and yet you go there and you walk out of there. I've visited those people in the hospital, and I've walked out of there encouraged myself. I was like, wow, I went in there to encourage them, and they encouraged me because they're focused on the goodness of God and not on their pride, because God appointed that to happen, and He sent them into our life, and He's there, and we can get...
And I think He does that.
I know He does, yeah.
Okay.
And so He gets us...
We're just flabbergasted by those things.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah, because
Yes.
it gets us focused on something. They're able to get us focused on something else. And sometimes if it was people we know and they came, they wouldn't be able to change our focus. But, God is saying here to Job, look, I want you to focus on me and how great I am, and get your focus off of what I'm going through. So yeah, I agree. God sends those people. Now let's look at Job's response. Someone read chapter 40, verses 1 through 8. Okay, so we see, you remember earlier, Do you remember this statement that Job made? As a prince, I would go near unto God. Wow, what a statement. So we see Job is in a different place now, and he is not acting as though, well, I'm a prince, and like Stan was talking about earlier, well, God, I've done all this. You owe me, you owe me, you owe me. Now Job is coming down a notch, and he's, saying, wait a minute, I'm looking at this differently now. And then God tells him, prepare yourself, Job. I've got some stuff I'm going to bring to you, because I want you to move away from those faulty attitudes about me and about yourself. And so now Job is better prepared for God's next response. And this passage reminds me of Psalm 46:10 that says, be still and know that I am God.
Yes.
Sometimes that's the hardest thing for me to do, is to get quiet and listen to God and let him speak into my life. And so he's telling him, you need to calm down here, Job, and we see a difference. Job is saying, hey, I feel unworthy. I feel like a vile person. He's realizing that, wait a minute, I need to change my attitude about this. I need to look at this differently. Okay, so God challenges Job's strength. Someone read verses 9 through 14 of chapter 40. Human strength is weak would be a title for this. Okay, so Job is asked here to defeat the wicked. God is really pushing Job here, and he's saying, first of all, let's compare yourself to me. And he says, do you have a strong arm like I have? Are you as strong as I am? And then he goes on to say, do you have a voice like thunder? I'm sure Job had to say no to that one. Can you adorn yourself in beauty? Because when we look around at nature, God has adorned nature with beauty, and it's like, wow. And he says, can you humble the proud? Are you able to bring the proud down? I'm always amazed at what goes on when we have somebody who's proud, and I'm reluctant to use what I'm thinking as an example, but we have those people that are proud, and we want to bring them, we try to bring them down, and a really proud person, you don't bring them down. They just find a way to worm around it. They just try to find an excuse. Well, I did this because blah, 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 blah. What? No, you were wrong. Just admit you were wrong. Confess that. But the proud, it's hard to bring them down. But you know what? God can bring them down. It's interesting. I've seen people that were proud and arrogant and living a life that was, taking advantage of people and ruling over them and running over them, and God humbled them and brought them down. He has a way of doing it. He has a way of bringing down the proud. I always feel like that as a Christian, God either has to bring us down or he has to bring us up. Because some people really think lowly of themselves, and they need God in their life so they can have a healthy respect for themselves. And some people are arrogant. They think more highly of themselves than they ought, and they need to be brought down. And God has a way of saying, no, right here's where you need to be. I can lift you up, or I can bring you down. So if you want to be proud and arrogant and go on, and he's saying to Job, can you do this? And so then he basically says to Job, okay, if you can do these things, then I'm ready to listen to you. I'm ready to hear what you've got to say. If you can't do this stuff, if you're man enough to admit, you know what, God, that's all on you. That's all that you can do. I don't have the power. I don't have the strength. I don't have the ability. Then he says, then maybe you need to be listening to me. The perspective is God operates according to plans we cannot see and in ways we cannot understand. That's hard. That's hard to be able to admit, okay, God, your plan is bigger than me. Your plan, I don't understand it. This doesn't make any sense. Why? And sometimes there's things happen in our life, and sometimes it's little things. I've said, God, why did you let that happen? Why did you let me have that flat tire? What are you doing, God? But he's like, you don't understand. Just do what you need to do. And I think that many times with us, God is trying to get us to admit you know what? I don't have the solution. I don't know. God, I have to trust in you. I have to trust in Jesus. More and more in my life, I'm realizing I have to trust in the Lord every day of my life. No matter what I'm facing, no matter what I'm against, I may think I've got the answer, and I may have people around me think they got the answer, but the truth of the matter is, I have to trust in the Lord in my life. And that's what he's trying to get Job to come to that place. And he drives it home even farther. He's saying to Job, I'm all powerful. Someone read verses 15 through 24 of chapter 40. Okay, so this behemoth that he's talking about, do you have any idea what that is? It's the hippopotamus, is what most people think that that this verse is talking about. So God's saying, Job, did you ever create a hippopotamus? Did you ever bring one under control? Can you go down there and bring the hippopotamus and bring him out and put a ring in his nose and lead him around? No. You better not try to do that, or that hippo will kill you. What he's saying is your power compared to my power, Job. I've created a beast that can stay in the floodwaters and he doesn't worry about it. I've created a beast that you better not try to do it alone. Now, we bring some of these hippos under control, but it's usually a whole team of people with all kinds of equipment to bring this thing under control. And then it's questionable whether it's under control. If you go to the zoo and you see one, the cage that they got this crazy thing is, sometimes I'm not sure that cage will hold them. But anyway, God's making a comparison here. He's reminding him, look at the awesome power that I have compared to your human frailty. God, Job, you need to see that. You need to see that you're just a human being and I'm God. He always wants us to be reminded of that. And so what that does is it invites us, if we see who God is, it invites us to trust him. He's above all, and he cares for his people. That's what I want to end the thought with today. He's above all, and he cares for us. And sometimes that's hard for us to realize that when we're going through things, and that's what he's saying to Job. Job, look how powerful I am. I care about you. I got this under control. I got it. Job, just trust in me. And that's what he wants us to do, is he wants us to trust in him. To really allow him to help us work our way through things.